This is Chapter 3, Section 2, The Brain in our Control Center. Main idea: the human brain has many parts that work together to coordinate body movement, create thought and emotions, and shape behaviors. So some things to think about during this lesson. What were some of the early beliefs about the brain? What are the parts of the brain? And how do they function? What is the cerebral cortex divided into? And which methods do scientists use to study the brain? Alright, parts of the brain. The human brain is composed of many parts that work together to organize our movements, create our thoughts, form our emotions, and produce our behaviors. Scientists have identified the localized functions of different parts of the brain. The brain is divided into three sections: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. The hindbrain is the lower portion of the brain that is involved with many vital functions such as heart rate, respiration, and balance. It is called the hindbrain because it is at the back of the brain as it rests on the skull. And the midbrain includes the areas that are involved in the vision and hearing, and the forebrain is the front area of the brain, is involved in complex functions such as thought and emotions. Yeah, you don't want to mess up your forebrain. You don't want to mess up any part of your brain, especially not the forebrain. The medulla, the pods, and the cerebrum are important structures of the hindbrain, and the medulla is involved in vital functions such as heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing. The pons is located in the front of the medulla and is involved in regulating body movement, attention, sleep, and alertness. The cerebrum is a Latin word for little brain, and the cerebrum looks like the larger part of the brain, under which it rests but is much smaller. It is involved in balance and coordination, so don't mess up your cerebrum. A person whose cerebrum is injured may have trouble with coordination. A person may walk unsteadily and even occasionally fall down. The midbrain is located between the hindbrain and the forebrain. Areas within the midbrain involve our vision and hearing. Eye movement, for example, is controlled by an area in the midbrain. In addition, the midbrain contains parts of the reticular activating system, and the reticular activating system begins in the hindbrain and rises through the midbrain into the lower part of the forebrain. This system is important for attention, sleep, and arousal. Stimulation to the reticular activating system makes us alert. It affects arousal by increasing heart rate and blood pressure, and increases brain activity. Some drugs, such as alcohol, reduce the activity in the reticular activating system, thus affecting alertness and reaction time. So when you drink alcohol, you're a little bit slower. Sudden, loud noises stimulate the reticular activating system and can awake a sleeping person. However, the reticular activating system can screen out some noises. A person who lives in the city may not be awakened by the sounds of trafficking roaring by. The same person may, however, awaken to sounds that are more out of the ordinary, such as a bird singing, or even if the sounds are very soft. So some people can sleep through roaring traffic, and some people get awoken by sounds that are like birds chirping, like me. I'm a light sleeper. Alright, parts of the brain. Here's the forebrain in the yellow and the orange. The hindbrain is somewhere in the middle of all that. I guess the purple down here. The cerebrum, pons, medulla. There's the midbrain. Got a lot of stuff, a lot of squishy stuff going on up here. Don't mess up your brain. Wear a helmet, kids. Alright, here's the sensory and motor areas of the brain. This is where vision's controlled. This is your primary motor cortex, how you move your body, and the frontal lobe as well. All right, the average human adult brain has more than 10 billion cells. Whoa, that's a lot. Although the brain makes up about 2 to 3% of a person's body weight, interesting, it requires about 20% of the blood's oxygen supply. That's a lot. The brain does everything. Don't mess up the brain. Four key areas of the forebrain are the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the limbic system, and the cerebrum. Contained parts of the forebrain are very well developed in human beings. The forebrain is the part of the brain that makes it possible for humans to engage in complex thinking processes. Thalamus is a Latin word meaning inner chamber, and the thalamus is a critical structure of the brain because it serves as a relay station for sensory stimulation. So what does that mean? It means that most of the message is coming from the sense organs go through the thalamus into the way of the higher levels of the brain. Those areas are responsible for mental processes such as thinking or reasoning. That's what a mental process is. The thalamus transmits sensory information to the areas of the brain that interpret and respond to the information, and the thalamus also relays sensory input from the eyes and the ears to the appropriate parts of the brain for interpretation of the input. The hypothalamus lies between the thalamus. The hypothalamus is tiny and is extremely important because it is involved in many aspects of the behavior of psychology functions. It is vital to the regulation of body temperature, the storage of nutrients, and various aspects of motivation and emotion. So if somebody's motivation is down, maybe their hypothalamus just isn't working. It's a joke. It's supposed to be funny. It's also involved in hunger, thirst, sexual behavior, caring for an offspring, and aggression. So if you mess up your hypothalamus, maybe you won't be hungry anymore. Disturbances with the hypothalamus can lead to unusual drinking and eating behaviors, or it might make you more hungry. Among animals, stimulation and parts of the hypothalamus triggers behaviors such as fighting, mating, and even nest building. Nest building. Interesting. Although the hypothalamus is also important to humans, our behavior is less mechanical than other animals and tends to be influenced by cognitive functions such as thought, choice, and the value system. Cognitive functions are like thought and choice. Things you can't really measure. Things you can't really see. The limbic system forms a fringe along the inner edge of the cerebrum. It gets its name from the Latin word limbus, which implies the idea of a circle or a ring. The limbic system forms a kind of border around the brainstem and involves learning and memory, emotion, hunger, sex, and aggression. The branch of psychology called evolutionary psychology has studied this area extensively. Evolutionary psychologists believe that the limbic system controls behaviors that are necessary for the survival of humans and other mammals. For example, it allows a person to distinguish between agreeable and disagreeable situations. The brain forms emotional memories of situations that help a person respond and adapt to the situation. Psychologists believe that these areas are very specialized and are only active when triggered. If a particular part of the limbic system is damaged, people can recall old memories but do not create new memories. And for example, a man with damage to the area may have vivid childhood memories of playing with his sister, but may not remember that the same sister visited him earlier in the day. Interesting. Researchers have also found that the destruction of another specific area in the limbic system can lead animals to show passive behavior. Destruction of still another area of the limbic system causes some animals to behave aggressively, even when there seems to be no reason to do so. The cerebrum, Latin for brain, is the crowning glory of the brain. Only in human beings does the cerebrum make up such a large part of the brain. It accounts for about 70% of the brain's total weight. The cerebrum is the site of most conscious and intellectual activities. The surface of the cerebrum is wrinkled with ridges, and it has valleys too. This surface is called the cerebral cortex. And the cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the brain, just as bark is to the outer layer of a tree. The cerebral cortex is the part of the brain that we tend to think of when we talk about the brain. It's the part that makes us uniquely humans. It's the part that thinks. In addition to thinking, the cerebral cortex also deals with memory, language, emotions, complex motor functions, perception, and more. So, how do the functions of the midbrain and forebrain differ? That's a great question. Alright, cerebral cortex is composed of two sides, the left side and the right side. Each side is called a hemisphere. To visualize the cerebral cortex, think of a walnut. The shell of the walnut is like the skull. Just as the walnut has two sides that are connected, so does the brain. And in the brain, the structure that connects the two hemispheres is also called the corpus callosum. Information received by one side of the brain is transmitted to the opposite side of the hemisphere of the brain. For example, if you touch something with your left hand, that information is sent to the right side of your brain. If you touch something with your right hand, the left hemisphere of the brain receives the information. The corpus callosum aids in getting information from one side of the brain to the other. Each hemisphere of the cerebral cortex is divided into four parts called lobes. The frontal lobe lies behind the forehead, and the parietal lobe lies on top and the rear of the head. The temporal lobe lies to the side, just below the ears. And the occipital lobe is located in the back of the head. Some sensations, like visual sensations, are received primarily in one lobe. However, each lobe does not necessarily act independently from the others. One function requires the interplay of several lobes. The involvement of the cerebral cortex in the sense and motor behavior is a good illustration of this interaction. So the brain works together is basically what I'm trying to say. You got four different parts and four different lobes. You got a bunch of different parts, but the cerebral cortex is divided into four lobes. And most people think, when you think of the brain, most people think of the cerebral cortex. The occipital lobe is the primary visual area of the cerebral cortex. When light strikes the eyes, neurons in the occipital lobe fire, enabling us to see. We also see flashes of light. If neurons in this lobe are stimulated by electrodes, damage to different parts of this lobe can create an unusual condition. People with damage to one area may be able to recognize an object, but they may be unable to differentiate it from another object that is similar. For example, if shown a key, they may know that they see a key, but they may not be able to tell it apart from another key. Interesting. All right. So wrapping this up, the brain is composed of three major sections: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. The cerebral cortex, the part of the brain that controls thinking, memory, language, emotions, complex motor functions, perceptions, and more. And when we think of the brain, we tend to think of the cerebral cortex. Hopefully you learned something today. That's your lesson. Peace out.